There is one weapon that has haunted Putin's military throughout this war. It isn't a missile or a fighter jet. It's a machine that costs less than a used laptop, something a teenager could build in a garage, yet it has been setting Russian tanks on fire in open fields across Ukraine for years without any real answer from Moscow. In modern warfare, a machine worth a few $100s can destroy a vehicle worth millions, and that simple equation has become one of Russia's biggest military headaches. So Russia turned to the one advantage it still believed it had, decades of Soviet military engineering, and promised the world it had finally cracked the code. But what happened next suggested the battlefield had moved on faster than Russia had. The answer Russia chose to bet everything on was a system called Arena M, a piece of technology with roots stretching back to the final years of the Cold War, built to sit on top of a tank and shoot down incoming threats before they ever land a hit. For years, this system barely left the laboratory. But in early 2026, Russian engineers announced something bigger. They said they had rebuilt Arena M specifically to finally stop the exact weapon that had been humiliating Russian armor for years, the cheap, swarming FPV drone. By July, Russian state media was already celebrating. On the 13th of July 2026, the outlet Izvestia published a report straight from a training range, where crews of Russia's 90th Tank Division were being trained on tanks fitted with this upgraded system. A company commander, Lieutenant Alexei Voykov, told the reporter on the record that Arena M had shown high effectiveness against drones on the range, and these tanks would be reaching the front line within days. That single sentence was a promise made to an entire army, and to every terrified Russian tank crew who had watched their friends burn to death inside vehicles that never saw the drone coming. Finally, Moscow said there was an answer. Finally, tanks could roll across open ground again without being hunted down one by one. 10 days later, that promise was tested in real combat for the very first time, and it did not survive contact with reality. On the 24th of July, 2026, in the fields of Donetsk Oblast, a Ukrainian FPV drone flew directly toward the rear of one of these upgraded tanks. This was the exact threat Arena M had just been publicly declared capable of stopping. The system had 12 separate interceptor charges built specifically for moments exactly like this one. It fired none of them. Footage released afterward shows the drone closing in, striking the tank, and the system generating absolutely no visible response at all. Not a single charge, not a single flash. The most advanced anti-drone shield Russia had ever announced to the world simply turned out to be a failure. It did nothing while the machine it was built to defeat flew straight into it. To understand exactly how a promise this loud collapsed this fast, you need to see the entire battle this system actually walked into, because that tank was never alone out there, and what happened around it that day tells you everything about how badly this entire plan was about to fall apart. The battle took place near a small village called Maiak, in the Dobropillia direction of Donetsk Oblast, a stretch of open fields and tree lines that Russia had been quietly building up toward for weeks. According to Ukraine's own State Border Guard Service, Russian forces had spent a long time gathering what the statement itself sarcastically called the remnants of their greatness before finally committing to the assault. What actually rolled toward Ukrainian positions that day was a column of 10 tanks moving along the only real route toward Dobropillia, and further beyond it, the outskirts of one of the most strategically important cities left in the region. Trailing behind that armor were 3 BM-21 Grad rocket launchers, each one capable of firing a full salvo of rockets in under 20 seconds, there specifically to blanket Ukrainian defenders with fire and keep their heads down while the tanks push through. Ukraine's Phoenix drone regiment, watching this entire buildup from above, made a decision that shaped everything that followed. Instead of going straight for the tanks first, Phoenix pilots targeted the Grad launchers immediately, stripping away the cover fire before it could ever be used. Once those 3 launchers were destroyed, the tanks were left rolling through open fields completely alone, with nothing above them but Ukrainian drone cameras watching every single move. From there, the Phoenix pilots worked down the column one vehicle at a time. By the end of the engagement, 9 tanks and 2 armored vehicles were burning in the fields and tree lines around Maiak, alongside the 3 rocket launchers destroyed earlier. At least 23 Russian soldiers were killed in this single battle. Ukraine's border guard service summed up what was left on that road in a single blunt line afterward, saying that all of that armored greatness had simply been left burning among the fields and tree lines of the Donetsk region. Now here is the detail that turns this from a bad day for Russia into something far more revealing about the state of its entire war machine. This was not the first time Russia had tried exactly this. Just 48 hours earlier, on July 22nd, Russia had already committed an enormous force down this same general direction. Units from its 8th and 41st Guards combined arms armies, along with the 90th Guards Tank Division, attacking from 2 directions at once. That earlier assault lasted about 4 hours. Ukrainian forces destroyed 7 tanks, 6 armored fighting vehicles, a Russian rocket artillery system, and another Grad launcher, killing 123 Russian soldiers and wounding 29 more in a single afternoon. So look at what that actually means when you place both battles side by side. Russia sent a massive force down this exact stretch of ground, lost badly, and then sent tanks back down the same road only 2 days later. The plan hadn't changed. The only thing genuinely different about the second attempt was a handful of tanks fitted with a piece of technology Russia had just spent 2 weeks publicly promising would finally make the difference. It didn't. Which means the real story here was never really about one unlucky tank catching a bad break in a single afternoon. It's about a piece of technology that Russia's own engineers may have already known couldn't do the one job it was built for, and the uncomfortable question of exactly why Moscow sent it into battle anyway. To understand why that promise fell apart so completely, you first need to understand what Arena M actually is, because this isn't some rushed wartime gadget. It's a system Russian engineers have been chasing since the final years of the Soviet Union, originally built by the Kolomna Engineering Design Bureau. It traces its lineage back to a Soviet system from the early 1980s called Drozd, the world's very first operational hard-kill tank defense. Here's how it's supposed to work. A radar mounted on the turret constantly scans the sky around the tank. The moment it detects something incoming, a missile, a rocket, a shell, it calculates the exact trajectory and fires one of 12 small explosive charges positioned around the turret, timed to detonate a few meters away and destroy the threat before it ever touches the armor. On paper, it's an automatic bodyguard, reacting faster than any human crew ever could. For decades, that bodyguard barely left the workshop. Despite repeated announcements and demonstrations stretching back years, Arena M had never actually been fielded across Russia's frontline units in any real numbers. Then, in early January 2026, Russian defense officials confirmed something new. Engineers had finished a software update by adding Arena M Protection, specifically designed to give the system a dedicated mode for detecting and destroying FPV drones, the exact weapon that had spent years turning Russian tanks into scrap metal across open fields in Ukraine. That update mattered enormously because it targeted the one gap in Russia's armor that no amount of extra steel had ever managed to close. And here's the deeper problem hiding underneath that update, the one Russia never fully explained to its own soldiers. Arena M's radar was originally engineered to detect threats moving at roughly 70 meters per second and faster, fast enough to catch an incoming missile or rocket-propelled grenade screaming toward the tank. FPV drones, on their final attack run, typically fly somewhere between 10 and 30 meters per second. That's not a small gap. That's an entire different category of speed, closer to a person jogging than a missile in flight. A radar system built to hunt something moving that fast can genuinely struggle to even register something crawling toward it that slowly, especially when that object is small, plastic, and flying low against cluttered terrain. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely stop you, because Russia had every reason to already know this. Back in November 2025, 8 full months before that tank burned near Maiak, respected Russian military analyst Viktor Murakovsky told Russian media directly that Arena M's radar had not yet achieved this level of detection when it came to small drones. The radar architecture the system relied on struggled against slow, low-flying targets built from materials that barely reflect a radar signal at all. That warning came from inside Russia's own military commentary circle, not from Ukraine, not from a Western analyst with an obvious reason to talk the system down. And despite that warning sitting publicly on the record for 8 months, Russia still sent tanks fitted with this exact system into a live assault and still let a company commander tell state media it had shown high effectiveness just 10 days before it failed in actual combat. And there's one more detail that makes this decision even harder to defend. Reporters visiting that training range in July noticed something missing from the tanks preparing to deploy. Russia took the wages off its newest tanks, and there were no improvised metal grids. Russian crews have spent years bolting onto their turrets by hand to catch drone warheads before they detonate. Russia had stripped that protection off entirely because Arena M was supposed to make it unnecessary. So picture exactly what that tank crew was actually sitting inside of when that drone lined up on their rear hull. Not a tank with 2 layers of defense, the old proven method backed up by new technology. A tank with only 1 layer, an unproven system that Russia's own analyst had already warned might not work, replacing armor that had actually been saving lives in the field. Even now, nobody can say with total certainty exactly why the system stayed silent that day. Militarny's own reporting lays out 3 possible explanations, and every single one of them is bad news for Moscow. Either the radar genuinely failed to detect the drone at all, or the crew never switched the system on in the first place, or Arena M had already fired all 12 of its interceptors earlier in the fight and simply had nothing left when the fatal drone arrived. Whichever explanation turns out to be true almost doesn't matter anymore, because all 3 point to the exact same uncomfortable conclusion. A multi-decade, multi-million-dollar answer to Russia's biggest battlefield problem just failed on its very first real test. And the machine that beat it wasn't some new Ukrainian superweapon built in a secret facility. It was something Ukraine has been mass-producing by the hundreds of thousands for less money than most people spend on a used motorcycle. Strip away all the engineering history and the radar specifications, and what actually destroyed that tank was almost embarrassingly simple. If you're enjoying this analysis, take a second to subscribe. Every day, we break down the battles, technology, and strategy shaping the war using verified sources, maps, and battlefield footage. Now let's see how a machine costing just a few $100s has spent years destroying armored vehicles worth millions and became one of Russia's most persistent battlefield problems. An FPV drone is, at its core, a racing quadcopter, the exact same kind of machine hobbyists fly through obstacle courses for fun, fitted with a small explosive warhead on the front and a camera feeding live video back to a pilot sitting somewhere safe, miles from the battlefield, watching through a pair of goggles. That machine costs somewhere between $400 and $600 to build. The tank it just destroyed, a Russian T-72B3A, costs somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 million. Russia's newer T-90M tanks run closer to $4.5 million. Do that math, and you're looking at a machine costing a few $100s taking out a vehicle worth thousands of times more, a cost exchange so lopsided it barely feels like a fair fight anymore. And Ukraine isn't building these one at a time in some small specialized workshop. By late 2025, Ukrainian production of FPV drones had already reached roughly 200,000 units a month, assembled across garages, small workshops, and volunteer centers by people who, in plenty of cases, only learned how to solder a circuit board within the past year. According to NATO's own analysis, Ukraine's FPV drones costing under $1,000 have been responsible for roughly 2/3 of all confirmed Russian tank losses in recent fighting. Now, compare that production line to what Russia was actually trying to defend against it. Arena M took more than 30 years to develop, cost millions of dollars per tank to install, and depends on advanced microchip components that Western sanctions have made increasingly difficult for Russia to source. All that hard work, and they still couldn't stop Ukraine's cheap FPV drones. One side is producing a weapon by the hundreds of thousands every single month. The other is trying to defend against it with a system that still isn't in mass production after 3 decades of work. There's one more detail about how that specific drone found its target, and it's the kind of detail that should worry every Russian tank commander watching this footage. It didn't strike the front of the tank or the side where Arena M's radar coverage is strongest. It hit the rear, exactly where the engine sits, exactly where the armor is thinnest, and exactly where the system's radar and launch tubes provide their weakest coverage of all. That means a Ukrainian drone pilot doesn't need some sophisticated new guidance system or a way to jam Russian defenses to beat this shield. They just need to come from behind. It's almost insultingly simple, and it's exactly the kind of simple solution that a decentralized, fast-moving drone force can figure out and repeat far faster than a rigid military bureaucracy can patch it. And even in the best possible version of this story for Russia, the math still doesn't survive contact with how Ukraine actually fights. Arena M carries exactly 12 interceptor charges, 2 for each of the 6 sectors surrounding the turret. That's not a resupply point. That's the entire magazine, and there is no way to reload it once the tank is out in the field. A shield that stops the first 12 drones and goes silent against the 13th isn't really a defense at all. It's a countdown with a fixed number on the clock, and Ukraine already knows exactly how high that number goes. One burned tank column is a bad afternoon. What that column represents for Russia's ability to keep fighting this exact kind of war is a far bigger problem, and the numbers behind it are almost impossible to spin into good news. Combine the losses from Maiak with a battle that happened just 2 days earlier on the same stretch of front, and Russia lost roughly 16 tanks, 8 armored vehicles, and multiple rocket systems in under 72 hours, all while attempting to push down the exact same road twice. Zoom out even further, across the entire front rather than just this one sector, and the picture gets worse. Ukraine's own general staff reported that 28 Russian tanks were destroyed nationwide in the 2 days leading up to July 22nd alone, before the Maiak engagement added another 9 on top of that. In a single stretch of roughly 4 days, Russia lost somewhere north of 37 tanks, just from the confirmed numbers. As those numbers were emerging, Dymko Zhluktenko, a soldier with Ukraine's 413th Unmanned Systems Regiment, summed up the day in 4 words: "It was a good day." Here's why that number should genuinely worry anyone planning Russia's next move. Tanks aren't something you print out overnight. As of June 2026, open-source analysts studying satellite imagery of Russia's storage yards found the country had already burned through roughly 72% of its entire Cold War-era tank reserve. Out of a stockpile that once numbered over 7,000 vehicles before the war even started, only around 851 tanks remained in genuinely restorable condition. There's a second cost from this battle that never shows up in any tally of destroyed vehicles, and it might end up mattering more than the hardware itself. Every Russian tank crew who watched that Omega footage circulate now knows something their commanders spent months telling them wasn't true. The system that convinced them to strip off their own proven armor didn't actually protect the tank it was riding on. Analyst Jakub Janowski summed up exactly what that kind of failure does to a fighting force, warning that without active protection, it is currently very easy to throw a tank battalion into assault and lose it all without achieving anything. All of this cost, the tanks, the reserve stockpile, the crews who no longer trust their own equipment, was spent chasing one very specific piece of ground, and understanding exactly what that ground means to Russia is what makes this failure sting so much harder than a routine battlefield loss. Former Azov Chief of Staff Bohdan Krotovich laid out Russia's actual strategy plainly, explaining that Moscow has chosen Dobropillia and a second front near Lyman as its 2 main axes for this entire offensive, aiming to encircle Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and the surrounding cities that make up the last major fortified Ukrainian stronghold left in Donetsk Oblast. Dobropillia itself sits roughly 36 kilometers from Kramatorsk, close enough that a genuine breakthrough here could open a direct path toward one of the most symbolically important cities Ukraine still holds in the region. That's the prize Russia keeps sending tanks to chase, and it's exactly why Moscow was willing to gamble an unproven, decades-old technology on a single stretch of road instead of waiting for something more reliable. Despite everything thrown at this axis, 2 full armies, an entire tank division, and Russia's most advertised piece of defensive technology, Ukraine's own military assessment of that day tells you exactly how much ground actually changed hands. Widen the lens past this one sector, and the pattern holds just as brutally. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces reported neutralizing 22 Russian tanks across the entire front in that same single day, a number that lines up disturbingly well with how fast Russia is actually losing soldiers too. According to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Russia is losing somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 troops every single week, a pace that roughly matches how many new recruits it's able to bring in during the same stretch of time. So here's the honest, uncomfortable conclusion sitting underneath everything you've just watched unfold. Arena M was never really the actual problem Russia needed to solve, and fixing its radar with some future software patch wouldn't have changed the outcome nearly as much as Moscow hoped. The real problem is the open field itself. The simple fact that any tank crossing open ground in this war today is going to be watched, tracked, and hunted by cameras in the sky the entire way, no matter what kind of shield sits bolted to its turret. A defensive system carrying exactly 12 interceptors was never going to solve a battlefield where the other side is manufacturing hundreds of thousands of $500 drones every single month. At best, a system like Arena M buys a tank a few extra minutes out there. It doesn't buy survival, and the footage from Maiak proved that in the most public, most humiliating way possible. Russia built a shield decades in the making, announced it to the entire world as the answer to its biggest battlefield weakness, stripped its own tanks of the one protection that had actually been working, and sent them down a road it had already lost control of just 2 days earlier. A $500 drone flew around to the back, and the argument was over before it even really started. So here's the real question worth asking as this war grinds into its next phase. If Russia's newest, most advanced answer to the drone problem couldn't survive its very first day of real combat, what exactly will Moscow send into that same open field next? Because the pressure isn't stopping at Russia's armored columns. While Ukraine is dismantling the vehicles Moscow sends to the front, it's also striking something just as important far behind the lines: the logistics and commercial networks that help keep Russia's war machine running. In our previous investigation, we broke down how a series of Ukrainian strikes triggered more than $1 billion in reported losses at Russia's largest online retailer's warehouse network, revealing a completely different front in the same war, one aimed not at tanks, but at the economic infrastructure supporting them. Once you've seen what happened at Maiak, that story becomes even more important because together they reveal a battlefield where Ukraine is attacking both the sword and the supply chain behind it. That video is on your screen now, and it's one you won't want to miss. This is the Frontline show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.